now join Archbishop Dr. Dominiquae Bierman in Global Awakening.
Great is the Lord. Great is Yahweh, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful elevation, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King. Elohim, God, is in our palaces, has made himself known as a stronghold. This is the holy city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Jerusalem in Hebrew means a city of the inheritance of the double portion of shalom, the double portion of blessing, the double portion of wholeness, of well-being. And yet it has been the city that has been the most contested in the world by every person, every empire that has ever ruled the nations. Why is that? We're going to inspect that. We're going to understand that today. Why is it that every ruler in the face of the earth wants to rule from the city of Jerusalem, from the city of Jerusalem? I'm on purpose mentioning the Hebrew name today because the Hebrew name is the name. Can you say it with me? The Hebrew name is the name. It has been transliterated to many languages to make it sound different. But the truth is that the name itself of the holy city is very important, just like the name of the Messiah, Yeshua, is very important because it is the name that the Father called the city. He called it the city of Jerusalem, which means the city of the double portion of inheritance of shalom and well-being. It sounds like a dichotomy: shalom, well-being, peace, blessing, prosperity, and yet every empire has ravaged this city to the ground. In fact, when the Romans took over the holy city in year 70 AD, which was the last great exile of the Jewish people out of the land of Israel, they leveled the city to the ground and they changed its name and they called it Aelia Capitolina. Aelia Capitolina because in it they put an image to Jupiter Capitolinus. So they changed the whole function of the city from a city of worship to the God of Israel to a city of worship to Jupiter Capitolinus. They changed the name. Again, we are going to see as a trend in history that any time that worship changes from the God of Israel, from holy worship to pagan worship, also the names are going to change. Because what is there in a name? Well, just about everything. Because the name proclaims who you are. The name proclaims what the city is all about. The name proclaims what is the purpose of a person or of God himself, of Yahweh himself. The name is important. So the moment that there is a shift, can you say with me a shift? A shift from the worship to the Most High God, the God of Israel, Yahweh Tsevaot, to a pagan god of any sort, the city will change names. Let's check it out. In the Roman period, 70 AD, and all the way until the Byzantine period, which is Christian Rome, basically, we call the city is called Aelia Capitolina. Then later on, the city began to change some more names, especially during the Muslim period. During the Muslim period, you know, from the 600s and up, we have got the Islamic prophet called Muhammad. And he rises up and he begins to have a religion of world conquest. And he begins to move for the purpose of conquering the world, kind of like today. And they begin to move, and they also move into the area of Israel. And now they also take the city of Jerusalem, and now they rename it Al-Quds. That was a little bit better than Aelia Capitolina, because Al-Quds means the holy. So at least they know. But in their eyes and in their religion, that means that it was holy to Islam. Interestingly enough, in the Muslim book, which is the Quran, Jerusalem, and neither Al-Quds, neither by the name of Ilia Capitolina, by none of its names, is not mentioned at all. Can you say with me? Zero mention in the Quran. That's very important, because why do they make it holy for themselves if the Quran doesn't even mention anything about it? And it is because Satan is behind all of these religious systems that try to take on the city, the holy city of Jerusalem, so that that particular worship, that particular demon, that particular pagan god, that particular religious system will be ruling from the center of the world and from the place that is the most important piece of real estate in the world. How many of you know what is the most important, the most amazingly expensive real estate in the world is actually right behind me? You're gonna see it behind the walls of the holy city of Jerusalem, and that is the Temple Mount. What we have on the Temple Mount, and you can see prominently, is a monument to Muhammad called the Dome of the Rock. Because according to a Muslim tradition that developed much later, there was a special thing that happened here. And according to Islam, the Prophet Muhammad took a journey to heaven, and he was mounted on a winged horse, on a mythological winged horse, and he went to heaven and he met with Angel Gabriel. Do you know that Angel Gabriel is a messenger angel? He's the one that brought the good news about the birth of Messiah, right? So he's the messenger angel. He's also the one that brings the name Yeshua to the father, the earthly father of Messiah, which is Joseph. So he's a messenger angel. According to the Muslim tradition, Muhammad met with Angel Gabriel and he gave him the Quran. And then Muhammad comes down to earth with the Quran, and he gives it to the faithful. And that's how Islam develops. And according to the tradition, the Quran states that Muhammad went to a very further sanctuary. In other words, that he went away from the main sanctuary. And what's the main sanctuary for Islam? Anybody knows? Mecca and then Medina. Mecca is where Muhammad is buried. That's where the Kaaba is. That's where the black stone that they go there to make their pilgrimage and pay thousands and millions sometimes just to go to do that pilgrimage. Many of them even die on the way because it's a very difficult pilgrimage to go to the Kaaba, to the black stone. Mecca, the place where he's buried, the place where he was born and he was buried. And then Medina. Why Medina? Medina is a Hebrew word for what? For Medina, or the nation. That's where the most Jewish community used to be. And Muhammad relocated from Mecca to Medina. And in Medina, he tried to convince the Jewish community to ordain him as a rabbi. But the Jewish community refused. And when the Jewish community refused to ordain him as a rabbi, he got very offended. And therefore, he began now to do everything to spite the Jewish people as much as he could out of an offense. And we're going to see that out of an offense comes the most murderous religious systems that you can imagine. There are many people throughout history that have been offended with the Jews. Muhammad was one of them. Martin Luther was another one of them. He got offended with the Jews because they would not be evangelized by him. And at the end of his life, he wrote a terrible book that Hitler quoted in his book Mein Kampf as the reason for the final solution.
The Bible speaks about sheep nations, but I didn't know we would have an encounter with the living God. My wife and I, the bishop, were in Santiago, Chile, in a hotel room. She was outside praying and I was reading the Bible on the kitchen table. And she comes in excited and she says, "Rabbi, God just spoke to me." I said, "Well, what did he say?" He says, "What would happen if I came back today? How many nations would be sheep nations and how many nations would be goat nations?" I said, well, what did he mean? He says, "Well, this is how I'm going to judge the nations. How they treat my Jewish people in Israel, and if they keep my righteous laws and commandments." I said, "Well, what do you tell the Lord?" She says, I said, Lord, there's no sheep nations. Don't come back just yet. Give us some time. So that's the reason my wife and I are going throughout the United States to awake America so that America can become a sheep nation.
Offenses are very dangerous. They can bring about tremendous amount of murder. So in the case of Muhammad, he was offended, and then he went on to world conquest, and he did everything exactly the opposite that the Jews do. Instead of Shabbat, Friday. Instead of praying 3 times a day, like Daniel was praying towards Jerusalem, 5 times a day in Islam, they declare that Allah is the greatest God that ever existed. By the way, because of those proclamations, Islam has been growing. So those proclamations are demonically powerful in the spirit, and we need to learn the importance of prophetic proclamations about Yahweh Tsevaot, his names, and worshiping and declaring his holy name. And here in Jerusalem, as you're walking around, keep on declaring the name of Adonai, the name of Yahweh, the name of Yeshua. He is the greatest, you're the most wonderful. Saturate the air with words about his names and his power and his mighty works, because the power of death and life is in the tongue. And in the book of Job it says, you shall decree a thing and it shall be established unto you. And so they've been declaring that Allah is the greatest 5 times a day, to spite the Jews that do 3 times, they do 5 times. Then instead of Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim, there's one day of fasting. That's a major day of fasting a year, the Day of Atonement. Then the Muslims have a whole month called Ramadan for 30 days. Everything to spite. They don't eat pork, but they do eat shellfish. So you could see that there is an attempt to be like the Jews, but basically Islam is a replacement theology of what Judaism or what the Torah would have been. Now I'm explaining all that because we cannot separate the condition of Jerusalem today from what has been happening with Islam. So going back to the main message, during the Muslim period, the tradition developed, therefore, that this is a holy place, but it wasn't so important at the beginning of Islam. It wasn't mentioned on the Quran, but because the Quran says that Muhammad he went from the main sanctuary, which is Mecca, to a further sanctuary that is not mentioned by name, they began to interpret that the further or the remote sanctuary that Muhammad went to was actually Jerusalem, or was on the Temple Mount on Jerusalem, because everybody knew that there was a sanctuary on the top of this mountain called the Temple Mount, or the Holy Hill of Adonai, and in many ways it's also called Mount Zion. So when we're talking about Jerusalem and about the Temple Mount, we're talking about Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the house, the place of the house of Yahweh, and we also talk about Mount Zion. It's exactly the same. Mount Zion, Jerusalem is equal. So anytime when you read in the scriptures Mount Zion, think Jerusalem. When you hear Mount Zion, think the Temple Mount. And we cannot separate Jerusalem from the Temple Mount, because this was the heart and the heartbeat of any part of the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not Jerusalem without the Temple Mount. In other words, for example, today the UNESCO says that the Temple Mount and that western wall, the retaining wall where the temple that Herod rebuilt was, they said that there is no connection between the Jews and between them. That's quite amazing, I would say, don't you think? Because history shows us and archaeology shows us, because there's many digs around the Temple Mount, that there was plenty of Jewish presence, and not only plenty of Jewish presence, but plenty of priestly presence. In other words, you could see around the Temple Mount there is excavations where they've discovered the Ophel, and the Ophel is the place where the priest used to live near the place of work. And their place of work was, of course, on the Temple Mount in the Holy Temple. And they found those areas. They've even found houses with coins and mints from that time with Hebrew names, names of priests, names of high priests. And yet, I'm saying the nerve that has the UNESCO to declare that there is no connection between the Jews and the Temple Mount and the Jews and the Western Wall. It's huge because they are negating all of the archaeological findings, and they are negating all that the Bible has actually said about Jerusalem and about the Temple Mount. So now, since they consider it a remote sanctuary, then from that moment they begin to build on it. And then they build the Dome of the Rock to commemorate supposedly the journey to heaven of Muhammad. And then they built a mosque called the Mosque of Al-Aqsa. The Mosque of Al-Aqsa, again built in the 700s. The Mosque of Al-Aqsa becomes the third most important mosque for all of Islam in the world. Again, though the city of Jerusalem, though the Temple Mount is not even mentioned in the Quran, not even one time, it becomes the most important place besides Mecca and Medina. Again, it wasn't that much of a big deal until the Jewish people begin to return back home. When the Jewish people begin to return back home, they begin to fortify the Temple Mount. And they begin to claim the Temple Mount as their own. They didn't care about it too much, all the way from the 700s until the 20th century. They didn't care for it too much. But then in the 20th century, when the Jews begin to come back home, then they begin to put a stress and a special highlight on the Temple Mount, and the battle begins over the Temple Mount. That particular thing begins to happen under the hands of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, called Haj Amin al-Husseini. Haj Amin al-Husseini visits Hitler in 1941, and he asks Hitler to do him a favor. The favor was, help me to raise up an army inside of the land that will be able to annihilate the Jews altogether and implement your final solution that you started in Nazi Europe and Nazi Germany here inside of the land of Israel, which at that time was called Palestine, because the Romans changed the name from Israel to Palestine to commemorate the Philistines, the ancient enemies of the children and the people of Israel. And so Hitler complies, and from that moment now the Temple Mount becomes really holy for the Muslims. Until 1941, it wasn't so holy for the Muslims. They considered it as an important place, but not really. Nobody heard about it. Most Muslims didn't even know that it existed. But then Israel is established as a nation in our land. And so now we begin to have the battle over the Temple Mount, and in the news see the battle over the Temple Mount. So much is the battle, and so fierce has been the battle, that, for example, they don't allow Jews to come up there and pray. And the Temple Mount today, sovereignly speaking, is in the hands of Israel. In other words, from 1967, when the middle wall of partition that separated the eastern from the western city of Jerusalem, well, the east side was Jordanian, the west side was Israeli. From 1967, where the same war, when Israel was attacked by all the Arab armies around us, and we defended ourselves in a matter of 6 days, now we had the city reunited, and we had the Golan Heights, and we had the Sinai Desert, and now the borders began to expand much more from the Nile to the Euphrates. But what happened is that because the city now was reunited, the Israeli flag was flying over the Dome of the Rock, that Golden Dome. The Israeli flag, it's historical, was flying over the Golden Dome as a sign of the sovereignty of Israel over the Temple Mount. Who do you think gave to Israel back the Temple Mount? Yahweh, of course, because he wants the third temple rebuilt, and he wants a preparation for the return of Messiah. And as I said before, Messiah is not going to be ruling and reigning from inside the Dome of the Rock or from inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He's not going to be ruling from inside a mosque, but from inside his own holy temple, which will become the royal abode of the Messiah when he comes down to earth, because he is the Ark of the Covenant. Amen? Many people are looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Well, Yeshua is the Ark of the Covenant. He is himself the Holy of Holies. He himself is the high priest. Amen? Himself is everything. But the third temple must be rebuilt. So Yahweh gave us the Temple Mount.
Well, I wanted to tell you about one of the most important books that's been written in this century. It's called Grafted In. That's right, most people don't know what they're grafted into or what grafted in means. When you're grafted in, you're grafted into the olive tree. That's not the Christmas tree, it's the olive tree or Israel. And when you're truly grafted in, the Torah, or the books of Moses and the law and the prophets, are written on your heart. They're not done away with, they've just changed place. According to Jeremiah 31:31, the Lord is going to write his word on our hearts. In other words, not books of stone, but books of hearts, of flesh. And what happened was, after my wife wrote Grafted In, somebody in Papua New Guinea got a hold of it. And when they did, they changed all the theology throughout all the theological books and only used the Bible and Grafted In. Read Grafted In, it'll change your life.
Moshe Dayan, unfortunately, who was a great hero of war, the one that had a patch in his eye, and he was also the Minister of Defense at the time of the Six-Day War. As heroic as he was humanistic, and he did not really believe in Elohim in a vital, living way. He did not really believe in the covenant scriptures. And so out of fear for retaliation from the Muslims, he gave away the Temple Mount that we received in a silver platter. He gave it away to the Muslim authorities as an autonomy. That is called the Waqf. The Waqf are the Muslim authorities. And they received from the nation of Israel, from the state of Israel, in order to appease them, the autonomy over the Temple Mount. And that was the biggest tactic mistake that was ever done in the history of Israel. Because it caused us to lose 50 years of battle right here on the Temple Mount. I'm going to explain why. Because whoever rules the Temple Mount, whoever sits on the Temple Mount, that is the one that is going to be ruling the nations. The Temple Mount is a portal of heaven. Some people were asking me about portals yesterday. My book, The Key of Abraham, explains it very clearly about the difference between portals of heaven and gates of hell. But you see, portals of heaven can become gates of hell. The Temple Mount was a portal of heaven because portals of heaven are actually dedicated by sacrifice. Bethel by Abraham was a portal of heaven. When we go to Shiloh, we're going to pass in the area of Bethel. He made a sacrifice in the land when he began to possess the land according to the promise. Now, Mount Moriah, which is where Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac and ends up sacrificing a ram that was caught in the thickets as the substitutional offering. Mount Moriah is a portal of heaven. Mount Moriah is the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount is ancient Mount Moriah. Now, not only that, you remember when David was fighting for Israel, and he was wanting to stop the plague that was released because he was counting Israel, and Yahweh was punishing Israel. And he saw an angel that was stopping over the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And in that threshing floor, he went to do a sacrifice to Yahweh to entreat him to stop the plague that was over Israel. And he purchased that place from Araunah the Jebusite, that threshing floor. That threshing floor that he was purchased with money by King David, that threshing floor where sacrifices were made to stop the plague over Israel due to judgment, that threshing floor was Mount Moriah, was the Temple Mount. Is exactly the same place that you're looking at right now, where the Muslims have been sitting under the autonomy of the Waqf. Autonomy, though, is not a sovereignty. Autonomy is an autonomy. But because of the fear of the Israeli government to ruffle too many feathers, they've been allowing the Muslims to do too much up there, and they become violent. They don't allow the Jews to pray. They don't allow the Christians to pray. You cannot get a Bible up there. You cannot get a shofar up there. And if I go up there and I want to pray, and I have gone up there with groups and I've prayed, what I've done is I say, open your eyes, look at each other. I'm praying tongues and looking at each other like I have my guide's badge. I'm explaining something, but actually we are praying, because they don't allow us to pray up there. And any Jews that go up there and pray or proclaim or whatever, they can be really attacked violent and aggressively. The Temple Mount has become a cesspool of iniquity, and it is worshiping another God, because Allah is not the God of Israel. And therefore, before Yeshua comes back, and even as we're going towards the Jubilee of Jerusalem, which is from the 6-day war that got us the unity of the Holy City and the Temple Mount, we are going to complete 50 years, right? Where we're entering into the Jubilee, which is now 2017. Actually, we are already entered into the year of Jubilee of Jerusalem. Do you know that? But we're going to complete it in June, the 7th of June of 2017, 50 years. What is Jubilee stand for? Release and returning to your own family and your own inheritance. So we can expect more things to develop around the Temple Mount, where the nations probably are going to try to take it in order to make it like a neutral place and a no man's land, and where the religious of Israel are going to arise and begin to fight for the Temple Mount to come into the hands of Israel. And of course, we know that the temple artifacts are ready. We know that the stones to build up the temple are also ready. We also know the menorah is ready. And we also know that the Levitical priesthood is being prepared to officiate in the Holy Temple. Beloved, we're entering into the most exciting times concerning Jerusalem, but we need to pray that the false worship system of a false god called Allah will be removed from the Temple Mount, and we can restore the worship to Yahweh and have Yeshua return on the Mount of Olives and rule and reign the nations all the way from the Temple Mount. Amen? Praise the living Yah. Amen. Thank you.
Shalom from Israel. I want to invite you to our new tour coming up. It's called Uniting Nations for Israel. That's right, it's going to be a tremendous tour from north to south, east to west.
We come from different nations all around the world, and that we come from different church denominations. I believe that the reason for this is that we all love Yeshua, we love the Torah, we love the truth, and we love the Spirit.
I really just enjoyed how much she taught that replacement theology and how much damage it does, and why we have to go out, and the urgency of teaching about the importance of removing replacement theology from our lives.
And I just want to encourage the nations that Kadesh Map Ministries is the platform that is bringing and preparing the end-time Messianic bride to know and understand the timings of the coming of the Messiah.